happy to say that I got all the hay baled for the year, and today we're going to talk about how that went, yields, and everything else that goes along with it. That's what's going on today on Farmertylerranch. I cut this field sometime back in the beginning of May, which is a little bit late actually for me, and the reason that I waited that long was just because I was sort of waiting for some storms to move through and waiting for a nice window of curing weather, which I eventually got. I don't ted or rake this hay unless I absolutely have to, and the reason for that is that I like to keep it in the windrows because it bales up a lot nicer, and if you don't have to ted or rake the crop, then you reduce the amount of damage to it, because each time you perform those operations, a little bit of crop damage is going to occur. In fact, in my neck of the woods, I don't think anyone even owns a tedder. They're just not used out here. We do have rakes around here, but for this style of hay, or this type of hay I should say, you don't rake it unless you have to, because the windrows are so heavy that if you fluff them up and rake them, you'll have a really difficult time making them feed into the baler. This year the crop cured in about 7 days, which is good. Sometimes it takes as long as 10 days. It just depends on what kind of weather you have and what sort of conditions you have. This year conditions were favorable and we had a pretty quick dry down. Baling was mostly uneventful this year, which is nice. We did have a little hiccup with the belt, you guys saw that, but other than that, things actually went pretty well. Now, don't worry, because I know a lot of people might get concerned when I tell them that I cut the hayfield and a storm didn't roll in. Well, one did. I did get a little bit of sprinkling out here while I was baling, but it wasn't enough to even stop me, and it wasn't enough to hurt anything. It wasn't a big deal, but I just kind of had to chuckle because it's like every time I go to bale hay, it's gonna have to rain a little bit, right? The biggest problem of note that I kind of touched on before, and that was my belt starting to tear at the splice, and it never actually broke, which was good. I did happen to catch it in time. But it forced me to figure out how to repair that and what to do if that happens again. If you're interested in seeing how all that went down, go back a couple videos and you can see how I did that. It's really, when you have the right tools and you know how to do it, it's easy. That's true of almost anything, and this is no different. By the time I finished baling the field, I noticed that another belt is starting to do that same thing, where it's starting to tear a little bit at the splice. So I'm gonna have to repair that one before next season, or I'm considering getting new belts for the baler, and let me tell you why. While I was baling this field, I was having a problem with the baler that I had a little bit last year, and it seemed to be a little bit worse this year, and that is I just have a terrible time getting that thing to start a bale, getting it to start rolling the core. Once it starts rolling it, I can go as fast as I want and it'll eat it up, but it's just getting that bale to start is where I've been having some issues. One night I was out here and it was like every other bale, it was plugging up when I would try to start it, and I was just, I was getting a little bit worried because I thought, boy, at this rate I'm never gonna get all this baled. So I went home that night and, at 1, 2 in the morning, I'm searching the internet, trying to find some answers as to why my baler is doing this. And a lot of people recommended that if you're having trouble getting a round bale to start rolling like I was, that you should lower the RPM and sort of ease your way into the windrow. And a lot of times that will help. Well, upon reading this, it didn't really make sense as to why that would work, but I thought, hey, what have I got to lose? It's free, and if I plug it up, then I'm really no worse off than I have been. So I tried it, and it made a huge difference. I would say that, I could drop over 10 bales, maybe 15 bales, and not have any issues with that thing plugging up, which might not sound great, but compared to how it was going before, this was awesome. So in order to remedy this problem for next year, there's a few different things that I'm gonna try. And I know on the starter roll, some people weld on those to give it a little bit more grip. The problem there is that now you are running the risk of messing up your net wrap, which I don't wanna be dealing with that either. And a lot of guys said that new belts would help, that even if the tread wasn't worn off, if the belts were old, they actually shrink a little bit, and the rubber also gets smooth and kind of less grippy. Think of like a really old tire on your car. The rubber is just hard and you know, it doesn't have good traction. Well, it's kind of the same thing with round baler belts, and I think that this baler might be running the stock belts, and the John Deere 467 was produced sometime in the early 2000s. So these belts could very well be 20 years old, and if that's the case, then they probably need to be replaced anyway. And this is made evident by the other problem that I was having, where all the splices are starting to rip out. And that might be a sign in itself that these belts are about done. So I could add some sort of grip. I was thinking maybe like bed liner to the starter roll. I'd like to look at a new one and see what they look like and see if I can kind of replicate that. Maybe new belts. Maybe the compression rack on the baler was removed. I've actually never had one on this baler since I bought it. And I thought about making a compression rack to put on there that might help it feed. There could be some issues in the pickup that's not letting the bale start. There's several different things that I'm gonna have to dive into and look at on the baler. But we were able to limp through this year, and I shouldn't even say limp through because it actually did pretty well once I figured out to lower the RPM like that. And we got all of this hay baled. So how much hay is here? When I got all done baling, the bale counter said 357 bales, but I've got two different sized bales out here. I baled up 300 4-footers, and I use those for my personal use. The reason that I like the 4-footers, well, there's a couple. Number one, the 4-foot diameter bales fit in my barn perfectly. 6-foot bales would fit in the barn, but the problem with that is that I'm not sure my little 8N would be able to pick those 6-footers up. It can handle the 4-footers, and I actually found that with the size of the 4-footers, the quantity of hay that is there, that actually works out good for my feeding program. For the number of cattle that I'm feeding, that's a good number, or a good weight for the bales to be. The problem with 4-foot bales is that it makes your baling time a lot longer because you're stopping and wrapping and dumping a lot more often than you would be if you're making 6-foot bales. 6-foot bales is the biggest bale that my baler can make, and after I made my 300 4-footers that I know I need for myself, I was like, you know what, we're gonna do 6-footers to finish this out, because that's going to save me some time. And you know, by that point I was about ready to be done with it. Some of you may not know, and you know, from above this field looks like one big field, and technically I guess it is, but there's actually two different property owners here, and half of this field I've been farming for about 5 or 6 years longer than the other half, and that half that I've been farming longer is starting to show some like growing pains, I guess. There's weed issues out there. There's a few things going on, and what that is resulting in is a reduced yield. I think by next year I'm gonna have the weed issues under control, because it takes a couple of years of herbicide application to really treat this properly and get it going in the right direction. What I'm having out there is wild oats, and wild oats may not sound bad because a lot of times we plant oats, but wild oats and planted oats are quite different. Wild oats, they don't get very tall, and they suppress everything else that should be growing with them. So wherever you have a bad wild oat patch, your yield of everything else is bad, terrible, sometimes none. And this year where I sprayed the wild oats, they had already crowded out all the triticale, so I had patches of just sort of dead wild oats where nothing else grew. So that really hurt the yield on the old half of the field, but I think next year we're gonna have it under control, and that's gonna be back up to where it was. So on the old half of the field, I counted 203 4-foot bales. Now, me and my dad came out here the other day and we weighed a bunch of bales to try to get an idea of what they all weigh, and they were actually amazingly consistent, which is good. But the 4-footers weighed about 500 pounds a piece. So 203 203 bales at 500 pounds apiece on 20 acres, which that more or less is about 2.5 tons per acre for that half. Now, I don't know, 2.5 tons for me, for this kind of hay is not very good. The first year I planted that field, I got 5 tons to the acre, so it's half of that. 5 tons, to be fair, is not common. I'd say a good yield that you could kind of expect to get around here for this type of hay would be like 3.5 to 4 tons. So 2.5 tons is okay. You know, at least we got something, but it's honestly not really that great. Over here on the new half of the field, I baled, let's see, I think 98 4-footers and 56 6-footers. The 4-footers on this half were consistent with the other ones. They were about 500 pounds apiece. The 6-footers, on the other hand, were amazingly consistent. I mean, within like 2 or 3 pounds of each other of all the ones that we weighed. And we went all around the field and tried to get random spots and, you know, tried to find an outlier and really couldn't find one. But these were all right at 940 pounds. So do all the math on that. This field is a little bit smaller than the other one. I think I usually call it 15 acres, but I actually think it's smaller than that. So just to kind of give it a round number, this field yielded about 3.5 tons per acre. The funny thing about this field though is a lot of that tonnage only comes from half of it. This west half is a lot sandier and it doesn't push hay quite like the east half does. But all in all, I'm happy with that yield. It's definitely not bad. And when I compare it to what I got last year, where we got almost no rain on this field, we got about twice as much as what I got last year. So when I look at it through that lens, we did pretty good. So now we are faced with the task of hauling all of this hay home. You guys might have noticed in some of the drone shots that I did get a fire break disc this year. That was really at the top of my priority list. Every day that I didn't have that done was a day that I lost sleep, because as many of you know, last year there was a fire over there on the levee and I lost a little over half of my crop to the fire. Now, a lot of you guys have asked, and I don't know that I've really talked about it that much, but you have asked if I was made whole and all that and kind of what the outcome was. Fortunately, the party that caused the fire had insurance and the insurance did reimburse me. So it was definitely a scary few days or few weeks, honestly, when I was kind of waiting for all that to pan out. But in the end, it worked out fine. So despite having lost half of my crop to a fire last year, I'm still kind of dragging my feet getting it moved home. And the reason for that is that the barn is not quite ready. I would like to make a few repairs on it before I move this stuff home. And I've also got my new round bale feeder that I'm building right next to the barn. It's going to be a lot of welding, a lot of sparks. So I'm kind of thinking that I probably need to have that mostly done before I start moving hay home, or at least before I start putting hay in the barn. So I'm not in a huge hurry to move this stuff, although it does make me a little bit nervous leaving it in the field. I disked a massive fire break here, so I think, you know, I won't even say it, but I at least took some precautions this year to prevent what happened last year. I can get about 13 or 14 of these 4-footer bales on my trailer. So to get 300 of them moved home, that's gonna be about 23 or 24 loads. Yeah, it's gonna be a lot of back and forth, but that's all right. I've got 56 of these 6-foot bales that I need to sell. So if you are in the Northern California area, my email's in the description below. You can shoot me an email if you're interested in buying some of these. So there it is, the 2022 hay crop. It's out in the field, hopefully safe and sound. Over the next couple of months, we'll start moving this home. But like I say, before I can do that, I need to make some repairs to the barn, and I need to try to make sure that I've got the rat population you know, hopefully eradicated, or at least diminished quite a bit before I start stacking the hay in there, because I don't want to put it all in there and just make a nice home for the rats, because come time to feed it, I'm gonna have a mess on my hands. Thanks for hanging out with me today, guys, and I hope I'll see you again on Farmer Tyler Ranch.